A good editor must have some sense of how to tell a story, and that involves a sense of rhythm. And it's a little bit like telling a good joke. If the joke could be a great joke, but if you tell it with the wrong rhythm, it falls flat.
Hello, I like video games, but I also like films. And if you've been playing blockbuster video games recently, you've probably noticed that many games are pushing to be more cinematic. Let's take the recent God of War for example. The whole game consists of one camera shot that never cuts to a different angle. It effortlessly follows protagonist Kratos and his son, Boy.
Boy, come boy, stay back boy, 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 boy!
So the God of War, his son, and let's be honest here, the most loyal cameraman ever, traverse across this virtual Norse world, seamlessly moving from combat to exploration and into cutscenes. It's an incredibly immersive aspect of the game that makes it feel like an epic, continuous adventure, and reminds me of the single-shot stylings of film directors such as Alfonso Cuarón in films such as Children of Men. Pulling off something this ambitious in God of War was no doubt challenging. I mean, not to mention the fact that I'm halfway through the game and neither of the two characters has been to the toilet yet. I mean, I know people don't pee in films either, but yeah, it was a bit strange.
I gotta pee on her. I gotta pee. Pee time.
So, from a cinematography perspective, games are making huge strides. But there's one aspect of cinema that I want to see games take more inspiration from. And that's film editing techniques, which might just improve the way that game stories are told. What you're looking at is prototype footage from Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. While experimenting with some ideas for a road trip section in the game, Asher Einhorn, who is a systems and games director at Naughty Dog, began experimenting with in-gameplay edits, essentially the gameplay equivalent of a jump cut. On his Twitter account, Asher expanded on the idea in that he imagined a road trip section where, whilst the player is driving, there would be jump cuts which would showcase the passage of time on the road, and this can be used to develop the relationships of the car's passengers. For example, the game could cut to the characters in the middle of a road trip style ridiculous debate, or then cut to one of the passengers sleeping in the back, or reading a book. I got in touch with Asher on Twitter, and he very kindly expanded on his original tweets, clarifying that the idea originated from a problem-solving exercise really. There was an idea being floated for a road trip, and huge though some of the environments were, they were never going to feel long enough. I wanted to give players the feeling they'd been on the road for a long time, and so I started thinking about the compression of time in film, and then thought of the jump cuts in French New Wave cinema. Speaking of something that is not French New Wave cinema, here's a clip from the 2012 Jennifer Aniston and Paul Rudd comedy Wanderlust.
So obsessed with your Joe's coffee. It had to be Joe's coffee.
It's great fucking coffee.
Oh, that water, keep on rolling, Mississippi Blue won't keep on.
We are fucked, we're fucked! George, stop!
And I ain't got no money, 'cause I ain't got no hurry at all.
So yeah, a bit random, but I think that clip showcases quite nicely how a road trip montage can be used for humour, the passage of time, and to quickly establish a relationship between two characters. Anyway, so as a prototype, Asher's footage is to me seriously cool means of telling a story and controlling the pace of gameplay. And Asher actually outlined some tricks he learnt to make the experience less jarring from a technical perspective, such as keeping a consistent road ahead of the player to almost replicate the idea of match cuts from cinema. I asked Asher if he felt that using jump cuts mid-gameplay might make the gaming experience feel, a bit less interactive, but Asher actually made the point that it very much depends on the type of game. The player is very guided in our games and there's regular cinematics anyway. In this case, it's really more like a playable cutscene, so if anything, I think it's actually giving control back to the player, rather than taking it away. As the iconic film editor Walter Murch states in his guide to editing A Blink of an Eye, you'd never say that a certain film was well edited because it had more cuts in it. So this whole discussion, this video that I'm making, it's nothing to do with a quantity of editing techniques, it's nothing to do with having jump cuts every other second, but it's to do with creativity and experimentation, which brings me swiftly on to in 2012, 30 Flights of Loving was released, and it's one of the first experiments that I know of which combined filmic editing and gameplay. The developer Brendan Chung did some seriously interesting things with this one. Check out how 30 Flights of Loving introduces you to its two primary characters. So from a pacing perspective, it's brilliant. It's the sort of smart, unexpected edit you'd expect from an Edgar Wright film. This isn't a totally unique thing to see in gaming. The Borderlands series did a very similar thing when it introduced some boss fights and some NPCs, but I think it's the timing and the surprise that makes 30 Flights of Loving's intros just so effective.
Looks like it works to me.
So what do we know in 30 Flights? Well, there's Anita and Borges, and they're your fellow criminals, and together, you're going to do a heist. Oh yeah, and Anita bakes a mean slice of cake. Great, you've played loads of heists in games before, you should know how this is, going to go down. 30 Flights of Loving seems to be all about subverting the player's expectations, since as soon as you've met your fellow heist people, the three of you set off in a plane to do the heist, but then the game smash cuts to the aftermath of a heist which has clearly gone very wrong. As a result of this, the game is simply more interesting and unexpected. It's funny, but it's also confusing, and it provokes an emotional reaction. This sequence reminded me of the opening scene from Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, which likewise, right at the beginning, introduces us to a seemingly competent gang of criminals plotting a heist, and then it cuts to their unfortunate aftermath almost immediately.
I'm sorry. I can't believe she killed me, man. Who the fucking got that?
Hey, let's cancel that shit right now. You're hurt real fucking bad, but you ain't dying.
I'm gonna die.
In 30 Flights of Loving, we don't see the heist. We don't need to see the heist. We're shocked like our character, but a bad thing's happened, and it's happened very quickly, and out of sheer instinct, all the player knows is they need to get out of there as soon as possible. However, 30 Flights of Loving is an experimental 15-minute experience. Could, a full game embrace this style of filmic editing in order to tell its story? So Virginia is a 2016 game which was heavily inspired by Brendan Chung's work on 30 Flights of Loving, so much so that he's actually mentioned in Virginia's credits. So it's a 2-hour narrative experience where you take on the role of Anne, who is an FBI agent tasked with tracking down a missing boy.
Boy.
Throughout the game, the developer's variable state utilised jump cuts to control the pacing of the game and advance the story. It's still an interactive experience where you control a character from a first-person perspective and you navigate various environments, but there's no filler. Traditionally in games, if you've designed a corridor, then so be it, the player is going to walk down that corridor. If you've designed a lush environment, to drive through, it really wouldn't make sense for the player to be able to just skip through it, to only glimpse it for a split second. Or would it? From a storytelling perspective, one of my favourite aspects of Virginia is that you're often handed documents that detail the backstory of characters and provide some of the only hints of what is going on in this, trippy Twin Peaks inspired story. But Virginia doesn't want you to know fully what's going on. It's trying to create a sense of mystery. So you'll pick up those police files or that letter and you'll scan the text. But before you can read it all, the game jump cuts away to the next location, because the story moves forwards. By our very nature, we're almost trained to be collectors. We 100% things. We get the achievements and the trophies. So I can understand why some players might be against this. Hell, in some games, backstory literally is a collectible, such as, in the recorded audio diaries from the BioShock series. It's a very important part of the overarching story, but from a gameplay perspective, it feels like an afterthought.
What is the difference between a man and a parasite?
And you know what? I'm guilty of this too. The first time I actually played Virginia for myself, I caught myself screenshotting these documents when they appeared on screen so that I could inspect them later at my own pace. And I think that really shows how trained I felt, how it was almost an impulse to want 100% completion, to want to know everything, to want to see everything, and to get value for money from my purchase. And collecting all this evidence and these screenshotted files into one folder on my computer, it probably looked something like this. There's a similar control over pace in one of my absolute favourite games, which is 80 Days from Inkle. In the game, you are racing across the world and you're stopping off in cities and you have little adventures. But because it's a race, you never have time to experience 100% or even 10% of the game in one playthrough, as you're always being pushed to the next location. It is a race after all. Likewise in Virginia, it's a race against time to find a missing boy, and frankly, narratively it doesn't make sense to give the player ultimate freedom to wander around these environments. And to go back to BioShock, scavenging through bins for audio diaries kind of is a bit of an immersion-breaking experience. Side note, I kind of love BioShock. I'm not really sure why I'm complaining about it so much. Anyway, Virginia embraces jump cuts, and I think it does so successfully, which is really impressive considering it could be quite a jarring thing. And I think it does this because it utilises different techniques inspired by film editing. One way is for its sound design, notably sound bridges which pass between scenes and almost ease you into the next location. Here's Virginia's composer, Lyndon Holland, demonstrating this.
And what will happen now is that I'll interact with this pendant and it will play a short music burst that will lead us into the next scene. So now I've interacted and the music is preparing to change. And that was synced to the music there, and that was one of the tricks that I was talking about earlier.
Throughout the game's transitions, sound bleeds between scenes, and this can actually be diegetic sound effects from the in-game world, such as, hearing typewriters before the scene in the police station, or it could be non-diegetic musical soundtrack cues, as Holland has just demonstrated. Virginia also utilises match cuts, whereby the game will cut between similar images to create smooth transitions, such as the cut between Anne holding the bill in the diner and then holding the missing poster outside the family home. It drives the plot forward and it focuses your attention on the missing boy poster. From a technical view, these shots make sense and they're easy on the eye, particularly in the opening section of the game, which practically acts as a tutorial but for your eyes. God. Oh, that sounds so pretentious. This is all basic film school stuff, but yeah, it just works a treat. One of the challenges that Asher had when he was creating his Uncharted jump cut prototypes that I mentioned earlier was avoiding players becoming disorientated or mentally having to recalculate their path through the world because it just needs to flow. On this topic, he clarified that I think the main point is that the goal the player is heading for before the cut has to also be there after it. If you're walking down a corridor heading for the end, and then a cut puts a table in front of you, it's disorientating. You need a few seconds after to reorient in the new environment, so it's vital that you don't have to mentally recalculate your path through the world. So what have we learned? Well, if you've taken anything from this video, I hope that, it's that video games can do some cool stuff when designers are open to trying new things. This is by no means something every game should embrace, but if you're wanting to create a narrative experience, a cinematic one at that, then it might be worth looking into the ways that film editing is used to control pace and provoke emotional reactions. John Burroughs is the co-writer and designer of Virginia, and reflecting on his game, he stated that, "I think there are perfectly good reasons for why games tend to choose to present themselves as continuous, unbroken real time, without cuts, and I'm interested to see if there are opportunities we failed to explore." In my chat with Asher from Naughty Dog, he seems to agree, and he quite nicely summarised that, "I think there's something quite important in developing this language. I think it's just a symptom of how young our industry is. Not only are the rules for this kind of language still being worked out, but they also require time to work their way into the visual language that players know and understand." When Asher was in film school, one of his lecturers spoke to him about how film cuts of all kinds are not inherently understandable, but that through watching movies as a child you learn the cinematic vocabulary, and that's when you're able to fully process it.